Good afternoon, everybody. Hello. How you all doing? You having a good time? Yeah? Oh, good. I'd like to introduce to you the conversation and discussion around neurodiversity and whether it's a superpower or not. I'm going to hand over a conversation here that Chris Arnold's going to be having. He's a strategist, creative, ethical marketing specialist, dyslexic thinker, and he's joined today by Tess Cooper, the co-founder of Collaborative Future, and Ross Barnes, the Group CTO of the AM Partnership. Handing over.
Saves me on the introductions. The title we gave was Neurodiversity as a Superpower, and I really want to sort of broach that not just as a statement, but as a question as well, and we're going to ask sort of some feedback on that a bit later on, actually. But first, obviously, we have our two panelists here who will be discussing this, and also we want some audience participation a bit later on. I'm actually going to first ask, because I imagine that quite a few people who come today are either self-diagnosed or have been diagnosed as neurodiverse. So who's neurodiverse in the audience? As I rather suspected. That's very good. So we're going to talk about it. So it'd be good to have some people who've got first-hand experience. I think it's interesting because people call it a condition. I'm not sure if the word condition is a good word. I think we're going to talk a lot about badging and labeling as we go along. And so I think the word neurodiversity obviously includes things like autism and the many versions of that, obviously dyslexia and ADHD are the most common ones that are referred to, especially in business these days. Although I have to say, again, if you look at ADHD, it has two very negative words, disorder, in it as one. So it sort of starts off with negative badging. We'll talk about that as well. As everyone knows, there's a lot of famous people who are ND. Elon Musk, very famously, is autistic. Richard Branson, the late Steve Jobs. Many people within the creative industries as well, innovators, inventors, actors, performers. And I've noticed over the years, having been a creative director for many years, that I've always had a very high proportion of especially dyslexic people in my creative departments. Partly because I found they're very good at problem solving and looking at things in alternative ways. And this actually is what led to us starting what was called the Diversity Lab last year, bringing a sort of collective of different diverse thinkers together. The thing about neurodiversity over the last couple of years, it's become a really hot topic. Certainly partly due to organizations like Made by Dyslexia. There's been a new one launched called Neurodiversity in Business by Deloitte. EY, 7 years ago, started up a center of excellence which specialized in bringing together neurodiverse thinkers, autistic and dyslexic predominantly, who were actually offering a higher level problem-solving unit for EY in Texas, in America. And it was so successful, they've now launched it to, I think, 7 countries. And they have been leading the way in pioneering, actually talking about the positive aspects of neurodiversity in problem-solving and agile business thinking. The World Economic Forum published a report recently saying that if you look to the future, 50% of the jobs we know today are going to be replaced by AI, technology, and the rest. But the ones that will be needed are the ones that need high level of cognitive thinking. And they cited actually neurodiversity as one of those areas we should be focusing on as really the future thinkers, which is really very positive. So LinkedIn has recently adopted the term dyslexic thinking. Some people in the community think that's good. Some think it's a bit novel. Richard Branson and Kate Griggs have been very highly behind that. But it does, again, put a positive spin on things. However, when we talk about neurodiversity, it is a double-edged sword. It has its positive side and it has its negative side. If anybody had the childhood I had, you'll know how crap it can be being dyslexic at school. And even worse if you're autistic at school or you have ADHD. It's quite a negative thing. So as we've introduced here, we have Tess on the panel here from Collaborative Futures. And we have Ross here, Barnes from Global CTO from it's actually the 6M and Partnership, yes. Now we're going to sort of keep it quite open. We're going to discuss between ourselves. We'll invite questions later on. If anyone has a burning comment you want to make, do feel free to put your hand up, because I think this is a very collaborative session, actually. So first of all, we're going to start off with the first questions today. Right, so is neurodiversity, and all the various ones that fit within it, a superpower? So, Tess first.
Hi, everyone. So one of the reasons why this is one of the opening questions is because me and my team disputed the title of this, partly because, so we run a lot of programs for young people, a very high percentage of them are neurodiverse, and I suppose we believe that you could class it as a superpower given how much many of us have to struggle through every single day in order to fit into a world that was built by and for a very small minority of people and for a very narrow set of brains and bodies. So you could technically, if you wanted to, class it as a superpower. I mean, I feel like it's often used by creative industries to extract some of the good problem-solving parts of being autistic or dyslexic. Or for me with ADHD, I know that a lot of employers sort of abused my ADHD in terms of the moments where if I was stressed, then I could be hyper-focused and I would churn loads of stuff out. And they were abusing it, basically. They were abusing some of the capacity that I had and then ignoring all of the effects that that had on me that were negative within my life. And I often say to my partner, who's probably the first person that I've been in a relationship with that truly sees me and my brain as a whole thing, that the positive attributes that I have, the moments where I can make lots of connections between lots of different things and come up with all of these brilliant ideas, is exactly the same function for me as the one that causes me to have breakdowns and to literally physically beat myself up. So it's the same thing. And so if you're gonna try and seek the creativity that comes with it, then you also need to adapt workplaces and adapt styles and ways of supporting people that accepts some of the struggles that come with it as well.
So Ross, I mean, your company employs over 300 people, you're international, you're part of an even bigger group. I mean, how is it perceived within your company?
I guess I can answer that two ways. I would say one thing, and Tess and I have only met for maybe half an hour before this. I think one of the superpowers of neurodiversity for me, and I possess ADHD, and I was diagnosed in April, so it's very, very early on my journey. But I think one of the great things is being able to instantly relate to someone, because everything you've just said there about the strengths, but also the weaknesses is exactly how I feel. And I think being able to see your, neuro mirror is a real power. But I'll answer your question, which is why I'm here, I guess. I think you can look at is neurodiversity a superpower in two ways. One, which I think Tess very articulately went through, is as a person who is neurodiverse. But also organizationally, I think there's a question about how agencies, organizations, companies harness the neurodiverse talent and recognize that with any superpower, there's also a kryptonite. And I think I wouldn't necessarily say the term abuse, but I certainly recognize what Tess is saying, and sometimes with a condition, an organization can only focus on the positive and only see where it's a strength without necessarily seeing where a person might need support. But the way that we handle that at M6 and the AND partnership, if we have a group of diverse individuals who form a committee called the Collective, and that collective does a number of things. It ensures that whenever we talk about diversity, it's not just box ticking. It ensures that any new hires that enter the business are interviewed by a member of that committee and are passed as a representative of M6. But it also holds us to account, and it ensures that we look after our individuals in the right way, in any diverse fashion. But it also makes sure that we walk the walk as well as talking the talk.
Just quickly on what Ross was saying as well, the funny thing that I find with lots of, I suppose when neurodiversity is looked at through a neurotypical lens, is I actually think that all of these organizations are actually missing out on the actual possibilities with the different ways that people's brains work, the different ways our bodies respond to stuff, the different understanding that we have on different layers, because it's being looked at through a narrow lens. And so therefore, and I think we'll talk a little bit later about leaders, but if you're looking at it through a narrow lens, then you're actually going to miss out on all of the possibilities of how that person could work.
I think it's very interesting. I've been working with a psychometric company called Luminar, and they're looking at the opposite way around. So they do a lot of psychometric profiling, which they do with a lot of big companies like Coca-Cola's and big brands. And when they're going in team building, the one thing they do is they obviously look at how different mindsets are, from the very linear to the non-linear to those who are very emotive to non-emotive. And so you get this circle of different skills. But what is very interesting, we've been overlaying neurodiversity on the top of that. And the way they're looking at it is, rather than saying, or you need a dyslexic, you need somebody who thinks like that, a big picture thinker, or you need someone who's very good in this. And by coincidence, that would include people who are dyslexic or autistic or ADHD. And it's quite a positive way for them to see the superpower, if you want to look at it that way, from looking at the skill first and the badge second. I think the second question I want to go to is, are companies, especially those in the creative industries, really giving the right consideration to neurodiversity when recruiting talent? This is the entry point to the industry. Are we really recruiting the right way, looking at it the right way? Or are we falling dangerously into a D&I tick box tokenism mentality?
I mean, I can only speak for my organisation. I would hope that our organisation would not allow us to be tick boxing and tokenism. But that being said, I think it's important for an organisation to have targets. I think it's important for an organisation to have a goal to strive for. And I don't think that's just numbers, although I think that's important. I think it's something that the organisation can show its colleagues, it's the members of staff within it, that it's committed to. And it's important to be really critical of those targets. And we do hold ourselves within our organisation very beholden to them. And creating an organisation that recruits in the right way is so important, especially in what is an increasingly competitive environment for talent. So I know Tess will talk about some of the great work that her organisation does, but as I said, we have the collective, which is a key part of our interview process. We use blind CVs. Our interviews are conducted either in person or in Zoom, dependent on how someone feels they may perform better. And I think when we talk about neurodiversity, there is no one description of what neurodiversity means. There is no typical neurodiverse brain, if that makes sense. So I think the best thing for us is open communication and asking people what feels better for them rather than making assumptions.
Yes.
I'm going to talk about the narrowness, again, of how we think about recruitment. So Collaborative Future, a lot of what we do has been transforming the way that organizations like find and hire talented people. And like a basic thing is like the CV, a CV works, again, for a very narrow set of people to describe a very narrow set of things that you can do and have done, or importantly, the opportunities that you've had access to. And so, we completely sack off CVs. We've got some blog posts on our website, actually, where one of our alumni from one of our programs talked about the fact that, actually, if you think about CVs, there's a huge percentage of disabled people who are unemployed. You're basically reinforcing the same situation, because you're saying, I need to see your experience, and then you've got no relevant experience, so you're perpetuating that. I also think some other practical things that we do, one in particular that we've heard helps lots of different neurodivergent people, and anyone in general, actually, is that we send interview questions in advance to people. And when you think about it, it's such a weird thing that we've upheld with these interview processes, because I don't want to have a conversation with someone where they've literally just picked something out of thin air, or where they've perfected their interview technique. And so I often say to people, with my brain, if I'm asked a random question, it is literally like a fruit machine, and sometimes stuff all lands at once, and sometimes it doesn't. You're going to get a random garbled mess. And so sending questions in advance means that actually people can get more out of that candidate, and that candidate can feel like they're bringing the actual version of themselves that they're going to bring into the work.
I agree. One of the big agencies I worked at, we had a big conflict with HR, who wanted to kind of bring in all this very neurolinear thinking. We have to have the CV submitted. I go, look, I'm a creative director. I'm only interested in one thing, the book. I'm interested in the talent of the individual, their attitude. I want to see the person, see the book. I don't care whether they got an O-level or no O-level, A-levels, exams, whatever. It's irrelevant. Just see the talent. And we found we were in real conflict with HR over that, because they wanted to have a process, and it was all about them safeguarding, tick the boxes. And in the end, we just said, screw you, we're going to do it our way. So on to the next question, which is, do you think we're therefore biased by the danger of possible tick box tokenism that's going on? This is happening a lot in the D&I area in businesses where, we're seeing that neurodiversity is falling not into a kind of understanding the talent as a superpower, but actually be just seen as another disability to tick the box of.
I would hope not, is all I can say. And I can, only speak for my organization and what I've seen in the industry. I don't think we're in a world where our employees will allow us to think in tick box and tokenism. And I think any responsible organization should be listening to its employees. And that's all diversity, not just neurodiversity.
Tess?
I mean, I would say we're actually all part of the tick boxing mentality, because basically, I think a lot of what happens within organizations that we see when we talk about diversity and inclusion is people know the right things to say, for a start, and they also, we as individuals are constantly attempting to assimilate towards what is going to make us safe. So if people that have been marginalized within work, think there's any risk that them being themselves is going to harm them, then we attempt as best we can to assimilate towards what the dominant culture is. And so actually, for me, any diversity initiatives where it's got anything to do with just sort of saying okay, well, we need X amount of people from this minority ethnic group, or we need X amount of people who are neurodiverse, it doesn't actually necessarily mean that any of them are going to be able to show up as themselves in any way. And because it depends on the culture that you have, and also each of those individual people's experiences and safety to do that.
I think that assimilation part is really interesting. We were having a discussion beforehand. It's about understanding in an organization that being a neurodiverse is acceptable. And I think that, and we were talking, I don't think that can happen by just people saying it. I think that has to happen by people seeing representation. And, the assimilation part that I think both Tess and I have gone through in our careers, and I wouldn't want to speak for you, so please, but I'll say just myself, I haven't seen representation of neurodiversity in an organization. I've always known I've been different, but as I say, I only recently got diagnosed, and I've made the choice, I think, to be, for our organization, that representation. Oh, question, sorry.
A quick question there, or comment? Yeah.
My team are probably laughing at that. They can't give me a deadline. Yes. Yeah. So on the when you said we ask what can we do for you, and she doesn't know. So we work with a lot of young people in our work, and a big thing is being able to see the types of ways that different people and organizations work, the types of things that they ask for. So for instance, with our recruitment process, once people have experienced that having questions in advance helps them, then they go and ask that of other employers because they've seen that as an example. So I think being in spaces where you're surrounded by people that have similar experiences to you in some form, where you can experiment with different things that work for you, and I suppose that's what we've created at Collaborative Future, is we're all very different to one another, and all of the people in our programs are different to one another, but one of the shared things is that we don't fit into the traditional employment structures in the same way. And so we've been able to experiment with different things that work for each of us for different reasons. And that's not helpful in the sense of if you're looking at massive like, there's such like linear career paths that everyone is sort of forced into. There's certain aspirations for what like good work looks like. And so a lot of our stuff is also around like exploring things like self-employment, collaborating with people that are, particularly within like the creative industry, right? Like building a network of people that can understand you and work with you in the ways that like you work best. And that's completely like, I'm using this term very lightly, completely alien to a lot of organizations and employers, like all of these different possibilities for how you can work. But like Collaborative Future would love to chat to your daughter, probably.
I mean, and I'd echo that. We'd love to talk to your daughter. But I might answer that question by asking you a question. You said that you employ her now, and you said that you love her. I'm assuming you love her as a daughter. Do you also love her as an employee?
But I would disagree.
Well, I have to say, having
That's because I
run
have a different view on time. We won't get into
having run
that.
many creative departments, trying to tell my creatives that a deadline has always been a challenge. I want to actually move the society from the beginning, the entry point, up through the ranks, up to the top. A lot of people believe there's a lack of neurodiverse talent or people at the top of businesses, especially at senior management. Now, is that true or not? We don't really know because we haven't got enough data. I did a little bit of a survey and discovered a few people who just honestly said, yes, I am, but I don't want to talk about it because it might be seen as a weakness. So actually, I'm going to start with Ross. Your thoughts about that?
I think you're right. I think we don't know. And I think to continue my point, I think it's important for us as individuals to represent. And, you know, I feel personally that I'm taking a risk being on this panel. I feel like I should do, because I feel the industry needs to come together, because without doubt, some of our most creative ideas, campaigns, activations have been inspired, helped, or devised by people with neurodiversity.
Yeah. Yes.
So yeah, I mean, I would say it's really important to remember a few things about this. One is like the intersections of people's identities. You reeled off a lot of white men, basically earlier, of like leaders who are neurodiverse, and that is the image that we see constantly, and there's particular stereotypes of that as well that actually stopped me from exploring my neurodiversity, because like, you know, some of the stuff around autism is like about people not having empathy. Like, that is not me in any sense of the word. Like, it's like sort of the complete opposite, but it might come across in that way to other people. And so having lots of different people that like have a combination of experiences and identities to be able to find what mirrors yours, I think is really important. And so I suppose we need to see within leadership more diversity within those experiences of neurodiversity, I guess.
And I think to build on that, I think that's really, really important. To build on that is because there is a perception that there is more neurodiversity at senior levels. I think encouraging our senior leaderships to start talking about it is actually a way that we can reveal a diversity that exists within leadership that's already there. And I think, from my personal, I can only speak from a personal point of view, being diagnosed late in life was a very liberating, terrifying, liberating moment in that if you name it, you can tame it. I know much more about who I am. And I think if people can see that representation at senior leadership across a diverse cross-section of people, then that can only be good for our industry.
I think it's interesting that organizations like Extraordinary People, which is now made by Dyslexic, tends to promote very high-end successful people, which is good, but it doesn't talk about the kind of middle ground, people who are just running companies. One of the things interesting, some research was done, did reveal that especially at the middle management level, where we get into very bureaucratic, process-driven mentality in most companies, that's the time when most neurodiverse people jump ship. And they either end up sort of in a crap place, or they start their own businesses. And if you look at a lot of, for example, dyslexic entrepreneurs, most of them have the same story. I went to work for a company a couple of years, and it got too process-driven. I jumped ship, started my own business, and they actually are quite open to bringing in more neurodiverse people. So you tend to find possibly less people at senior level because the middle management bit filters them out, which is a possibility. So now I'm going to move on to the next one is a stigma. I read a thing the other day, a blog someone said from a dyslexic guy said, it's easier to be gay than to be dyslexic because, people accept that. But if I tell people I'm dyslexic, I'm badged with prejudice and all sorts of attitudes. So I think we're going to discuss the whole aspect about stigma, badges, and labels and how that goes. Tess.
Sorry, I'm just processing some stuff that was said then. I suppose on the stigma front, one of the things that, and it sort of relates to your point about, like, you said, are neurodiverse people jumping ship? One thing that we often ask organizations that we work with, is can you tell us about the demographics of the people that you have managed out? And organizations hate that question because there's a lot of people that they manage out without it ever being, formal and stuff. I suppose for me, it is we need to understand the layers of privilege that people may or may not have within our workplaces. And I think it's really important for people with some aspects of their identity that give them privilege to speak openly about their neurodiversity in order to normalize stuff, but also remembering that is not possible for lots of people because they are going to be targets for more discrimination. I also think that it's really, really important for us to be, as a society, as organizations, as individuals, to be building that awareness of when things around culture fit and stuff like that are an excuse, and actually are there other things going on that are perpetuating stereotypes about people, that are perpetuating traumatic experiences for people that don't fit into a culture. So I think, I think it needs a lot of talking about and unpacking, but also at the same time remembering that certain people can do that more freely than other people can.
In terms of the stigma, and all great points, Tess, and I'll try and build unsuccessfully on them, I'm sure. In terms of a stigma in the industry, I'm usually on stage talking about the metaverse, Google, Facebook, etc., and I'm not as terrified as I am now about talking about my neurodiversity. So I think, for me, that speaks to answer that question. I think all we can, and I think that stigma comes from a place of a lack of understanding of what the experience of neurodiversity is like. Because it is truly, it is unique, it is your own perception, it is your own way of functioning, your own way of living that no one else can ever experience. And I think, to Tess's point, we need more people talking about it and more people helping other people talk about it. Because then I think the conversation will become more open and we'll really be able to harness what is at the moment probably an unharnessed superpower.
And just quickly on that, I just suddenly thought, actually, when we say more people talking about it, there's often a misbalance between people who have lived experience of something being asked to talk about their lived experience to a whole load of people that don't have that lived experience. So the place that I love talking about autism is within Autism Reddit, because then there's just such a different lens and a feeling among that group. Whereas it's a lot harder to translate things, and also when you're under pressure to like answer, again, very narrow questions about.
I think that is really interesting. And I think another lens on that, which would be quite interesting, is to hear from partners or families of people with neurodiversity, so that those that experience living with neurodiverse people, how they can adapt their behavior to form successful partnerships. Sounds like you have a very successful partnership with your partner who understands your needs, the same with myself, and I think that could help the neurotypical develop patterns, ways of working, behaviors that could help in the interactions with the
I think that leads very nicely into the sort of the last question before we open up, which is how do you create what we now call a psychologically safe environment? How do we get people to adapt? The idea that you adapt to your employees' differences, not that you expect them to adapt to you.
Well, I mean, I think this probably relates to the psychologically safe question. But actually, I was just laughing because one thing that I shared the other day on Twitter is that I'm actually quite worried about neurotypical people, in the sense that, like, literally, there's, like, tons of people that are never analyzing themselves, like, never going around thinking, like, oh, fuck, did I say something wrong? Oh, fuck, what does that mean? Like, oh, shit, I'm being misread. Like, that is worrying for me. And I think it's the same in every single aspect of, like, anyone that has a dominant identity, like, they sort of treat their experience as the norm. And so therefore there's not like critical thinking about that experience. And so I think in terms of creating a psychologically safe workplace, that actually the people that dominate those workplaces need to do a lot more introspection and need to be actively like and openly vulnerable, understanding and sharing how they experience and see the world, so that it becomes normalized to be that.
I mean, isn't vulnerability a wonderful word, right? And I think we are, as an advertising or creative agency, not necessarily an industry, and up until now, that has thrived on vulnerability. There's a lot of bombast, a lot of grandiose behavior that is associated with advertising. And maybe it's time that needs to change. And I think your point about introspection is really good. We need to hold ourselves as leaders, as colleagues, to account for our behavior, for the way that we work with our colleagues, and really provide a place where people can tell us we're wrong. So we have a feedback system within M6, which is an anonymous system where people can feedback for the agency, performance, behaviors, and all of those, apart from very personal ones, all of those challenges to leadership are read out to the agency and are answered in real time. And we find now it seems like it's getting worse because the complaints seem to be getting more pointed, but actually it's getting better. People are in a place where they feel safe, where they belong more, so that they're able to articulate those things that need to change.
I think one key thing is that while we talk about understanding neurodiverse thinkers, we actually need to understand everybody's way of thinking. You know, if you're a very neurolinear thinker, it's very important to understand that's how you think. I was saying earlier about, I've always had a problem in agencies that I will not have timesheets in my creative department, and I will always have a finance director come out saying, what's it going to take for me to convince you to fill in timesheets? I'm going to say, what's it going to take me to convince you we're not going to? You know, they seem to find it sometimes when you've got a very neurolinear thinker, it's much harder for them to understand us, whereas it's easy for us to understand them because we tend to have a broader mindset. So I want to open this up to the floor, so if there's any questions you want to put to the panel, or comment that leads to a question. Right, at the back, just wait for the microphone.
Hello, I'm neurodiverse myself. My husband's neurodiverse. I've brought up 2 neurodiverse young adults. I also now am a specialist working supporting neurodiverse people in a college, and I've done that for various ages in education, and I worked on a supported internship where we would tailor that support for people going into industry, into companies. And have you thought about sort of widening HR roles to have people doing similar support that would enable people to continue in their jobs with sometimes just very slight tailored support, but helping them reach their potential? And, you know, instead of them burning out or becoming overwhelmed or falling behind due to lack of organisation, and deadlines and planning, you know, there could be roles for people, and I think the HR companies and big companies need to think wider and perhaps job carve as well to enable people to be employed and show what they can do.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the organizations we work with have, like, they'll have DEI leads, or they'll have organizational development people that like really look at the culture of that organization and the sort of like support structures. I think we really haven't, I would say we as a society and our workplaces really haven't accepted just how much work has to be done to unpack some of the like norms within workplaces. Like, it's got to be a proper investment and an understanding of that investment for like support for people, or for what's the word that's used, accommodations for people, is actually beneficial to everyone, whether it's like, so an example I often use is website accessibility. Like, if something is designed for someone with a visual impairment, then actually that makes it easier for me to read as well and understand. It makes it like, and if it's written in a way, like accessible language, then that helps all sorts of people. And in turn, like, if you're not having, as an organization, to deal with all of the like burnout of people and well, they often don't deal with the burnout of people, but anyway, as a society, if we're not having to deal with like burnout and stuff, then actually we can reserve a lot of our energies for doing like more better things as collectives and as collaborators. But I don't think there's a lot of people within leadership that properly like understand the power of like creating change.
I think that's a perfect answer. So rather than hearing me say the same thing again, maybe we should get another question.
Yeah. Do you want to wait just for the mic to come over? Because they're recording it. Thanks.
Just a quick one. I wanted to get your opinion on the majority of people assessing neurodivergence actually not being neurodivergent themselves, and how you feel about that in relation to, like, say, DSM-5 and stuff, and how we as neurodivergent people can deal with that without being patronized or told we don't know enough, you know, like the general stuff we get anyway.
Yes. Oh man, sorry, I might let you go.
You've opened a can of worms here, yeah.
I again, can only speak from personal experience. I found my diagnosis procedure very, very useful. And I'm quite an analytical and logical type. So I found the testing procedures very eye-opening. But I understand, again, and here we're talking about neurodiversity, so there must be different ways that we can approach that, or indeed respect much more those who are self-diagnosed, I think.
Yeah, so I've still not made it through the official diagnosis process. I mean, the ADHD...
Too many forms.
The ADHD coach that spoke to me was like, I feel like that is a sign that you have ADHD. But I mean, there's a whole load of stuff, right? Like, I don't like interacting with healthcare full stop, because I had, like, tons of really, like, draining physical stuff that was going on for me for years, from teenage years, that I went to the doctors after going through childbirth with my daughter, and they were just like, oh, it's probably just one of those, like, you know, one of those pregnancy things and whatever, it'll clear up. And there's always excuses for that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, the entire system is not set up for, again, anyone that doesn't fit into a very narrow body or a very narrow mind. I think one thing that we found at Collaborative Future is, like, and one of my teammates is exploring this for a fund that we're going for, is the power of, like, peer groups and peer like support, I guess, where you can hear one another's experiences and build on one another's, like, understanding of themselves, and to hear, like, the different tactics and ways that people have navigated the systems that weren't designed for them. So I think that's, like, I don't know the only answer.
I think you make a good point that it can be very hard for people who are not neurodiverse. I mean, as an employer, at my agency, Creative Orchestra, we've always employed a lot of neurodiverse people, and I understand it. I understand dyslexics, I understand autistic, and especially ADHD. So I create an environment where I adapt to them, and I'm not forcing them to follow a system. But when I was in the bigger agency, it was the opposite way around. They just couldn't cope. We kept having to sort of almost defend them, you know. And I think there needs to be a greater understanding. And it's hard because people who tend to end up in HR, for example, don't tend to come often from neurodiverse backgrounds because of the nature of that job. And I think I spend quite a bit of time educating HR people into understanding this, especially even in the creative industries where you expect them to be more understanding. They are still mainly concerned with the more linear mentality. Any other questions? Hands up, anyone? We have one here.
Hi. Thank you very much for your talk as well, also neurodiverse. I wanted to know your advice for employees on how they can ask their leadership for support, because I feel in my personal experience, whenever I've asked someone for support, I've come across them kind of viewing it as a bit of a faff. They're not like outrightly discriminating against it, but I've always ended up having to really justify why I needed small changes because of the lack of understanding. So I've almost like held back on asking for support because I've been seen as a bit...
We hear this quite commonly, actually.
Yeah.
People saying that they go and ask for support or they ask for something to change and they look at you like, well, what's wrong with you?
Yeah.
You know, why do I have to, can't you adapt? And it's,
Yeah.
again, it's this lack of agility to adapt to the employee rather than the employee. So, Ross.
God, it's a tough one, isn't it? It's almost one that I don't want anyone videoing me the answer of. It's really hard. I mean, I held off telling my employer for a very long time. And how it was handled at our organisation is, and it was handled very well, by the way, but this may not necessarily sound very well, is that I was sent to occupational therapy once I received my diagnosis, which was a cathartic experience. But what it came back with was a list of adjustments that needed to be made for me by a healthcare professional. Now, and again, you know, listening to Tess's comments, you know, I only want to speak about the things that I understand. And that was a good journey for me, but I was on the C-suite of our business. I've been there for 12 years, so there was a certain amount of accommodations that were going to be made for me. All I can say is I would often, if you feel that way in a business, come pre-armed with the suggestions that you need the changes to be made and almost have a presumptive close in that discussion. Because it's a really hard thing if the organization isn't going to change. But, you know, a lot of these neurodiverse conditions are also protected conditions, so we mustn't forget that.
I mean, I was just going to say that one of the ways that I used to navigate this when I was employed, I employ myself now, so I don't have to ask. Well, I have to ask my team sometimes. But I think I've been quite lucky in the fact that I'm like mouthy as fuck. Like, so there was a point where I was like, I'm literally, I know I'm literally shouting at you, like the CEO and stuff, because I've said it so many times, but I also would have no issues about telling other people the conversations that I've been having. So I think a lot of people in an employment situation, for all sorts of reasons, it might be because they have had traumatic experiences in the past, or it might just be because they're not sure of the rules, like don't like sharing with other people. And the thing that I found when I was working at this company was that the more I spoke about things that I'd been asking for, the more you find people that are like, oh yeah, I asked for that, or yeah, that gets ignored by me as well, by people for me as well. And you start to like build on each other's voices. And that's particularly important because a lot of employers that aren't willing to change will try and manage people that they see as a faff out of that organization. And so I was very clear that I needed like other people to know what was going on, so that they can't, like it's all talked about and it's all open, like they have to engage with it when it's all talked about and open.
I found when I worked in the bigger agencies, the way I'd often handle this was actually to try and, first of all, you see it from their point of view. Finance directors are very neurolinear. And therefore try and put it in the context of feeling like a bigger picture and seeing what would make them think, oh, that's a value. So it's about finding a value alignment. So you go, okay, look, we can make more money doing this. Oh, can we? Yeah. Or we can save money doing this. You know, all these timesheets we're filling out, what a waste of paper. That's not fitting our ecosystem. Why don't we find a better way? One thing I found was very interesting was a lot of dyslexics were not claiming their expenses. Because filling out expense forms we all hate forms, you know, most of us, but if you're dyslexic, you know what I mean by that. And so we introduced a different system that meant that it all went to somebody else. So we had a few secretaries, so they did it all for us. So we allocated them. That made life a lot easier, just give them a receipt. And they got paid back, but there was a lot of things that weren't right. So putting it in the context of the finance director's viewpoint worked quite well. But sometimes, you know, there is that block. If you're autistic, for example, trying to create a quieter environment can be very difficult, other than just sticking headphones on. You know, so it's a real challenge. I think as we're coming to the end, I want to ask a quick question.
Can I just quickly say about if there's any organizations in here and any managers? I don't know if there is any managers, but my best ever manager, in terms of like when you were saying about like you being like having to repeatedly say stuff over and over again and being seen as a faff, my best ever manager was like, if it's going to cost us more to have these conversations, then just do it. Like, same with like experimenting with ways of working, like if it's going to cost us more, having to discuss it. And so he always took other people's experiences and needs as a given. Like, there's no need to fight it if it's going to be costly to have that like fight and that discussion about it. And so that was really
Sometimes they give up in the end. So we're going to ask you a quick question. Hands up all of those who think that neurodiversity is a creative superpower. Right? And hands up who think it isn't. Oh, well, that's good, isn't it? So finally, a big thank you to Ross and Tessa for coming along today. And thank you very much for coming along as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We'll be around here if you want to chat one-to-one.